We continue with Chapter 8, Death, Mortality, and Vitality. So many obvious and practical things change in a child's world when a parent dies young. Less immediately apparent is the change that occurs in the child's relationship to inevitable death. The grim reaper, the deceiver, the draining sands in an hourglass all assume a personal and perhaps too personal relevance. Death ceases to be a stranger, and for some it becomes the enemy that stalks them throughout their lives. Before children have any direct encounter with death, they imagine that death is optional, something they choose or perhaps decide to pass. I remember sitting in a restaurant with my 5-year-old niece as she scanned a series of portraits that rimmed the walls of the eatery. The portraits were of Renaissance philosophers. My niece asked me who these people were and if they were still alive. I told her, in language she could understand, that they had died a long time ago. She pondered for a while and asked me about her own death. I told her that she did not need to worry. Death would not come for her for a long time. She thought again and said to me, "I don't think I want it to come at all. I don't think I'm going to die." For her, death was still optional. As much of a choice as whether to have ice cream or cake for dessert. When a parent dies young, children are confronted abruptly with the reality that death is not optional. It is not something in which they can choose or not choose to participate. This too early encounter with the reality of death and mortality changes a child. A 17th century maxim proclaims that death and the sun are not to be looked at steadily. When a child looks steadily on the aura of death, his or her world is altered. For some, this encounter with death leads to a lifelong preoccupation with mortality and finality. Edgar Allan Poe, who was orphaned before the age of 3, spent a lifetime creating poems and stories that repeatedly asked the question, do the dead remain dead? Poe was obsessed with coming to know the dead intimately. Who are they? Where do they go? Can they return to us? In many of his poems, Poe wrote from the perspective of the one who had died, trying to enter into the mind of the deceased and to understand the mental state of the dead. Poe both longed for and feared a reunion with his dead mother. He imagined that to be with her again would be blissful, but to be reunited meant that he himself would die. In one of his poems, Poe writes, "I could not love except where death was mingling his with beauty's breath." Early death and loss defined what became the central preoccupation of Poe's artistic quest, both to understand and to master the complex interplay between death and life. Few survivors of early loss mix their yearning for answers with the creative brilliance of Edgar Allan Poe. Many, however, share Poe's fear of death. Some individuals told me that a day does not pass when they do not think about their own death or the death of someone they love. These survivors of early loss are almost always anxious that death will pay them another unwanted visit. For others, early loss leaves them not with a fear of death, but rather with an awareness of the reality of death and of their own mortality. These individuals often believe that they, like their parents, will die young, and this belief, taken as fact, not felt as fear, guides the choices and the decisions they make about how to live their lives. In ancient Rome, Caesar would often be accompanied by a slave whose job it was to whisper in his ear, "You, too, are mortal." For some survivors of early loss, the whisper of mortality is never far off. For others, life and death do not exist as separate and distinct states. Rather, life is mingled with a kind of death. These survivors experience what social historian Robert Lifton has called death in life, a form of walking death that allows them to merge elements of life with images of death. By living as if they are only half alive, these individuals identify with the dead on one hand and play possum on the other. If they are weakened and de-energized, perhaps they can fool death into leaving them alone. Finally, there are those who use their early encounter with death to develop a worldview that accepts the inevitability of an ending. These individuals live their lives fully, cherish their worldly experiences, but feel prepared to accept death more as a peaceful sleep or a long-awaited reunion than as a grim reaper. Well, we've got all of the birds arriving. So let's see if we can turn us around just a little bit here. And I'll continue with this chapter. I want you to see some birds together. As if you know me, you know I like birds. I would even say I was a bird person, if there was such a thing. Here they come. Oh, nice, they came to me today. I did not have to chase them down. It's a good day. All right, the fear of death. For some individuals, wait a minute. Finally, there are those who use their early encounter with death to develop a worldview that accepts the inevitability of an ending. These individuals live their lives fully, cherish their worldly experiences, but feel prepared to accept death more as a peaceful sleep or a long-awaited reunion than as a grim reaper. All right, now, the fear of death. For some individuals, the early death of a mother or father leaves them quite literally quaking at the prospect of their own early demise. These individuals think about their own death or about the death of a loved companion on an almost daily basis. This preoccupation with death limits their ability to engage in or enjoy life fully. Everybody's calm this morning. I like to pretend it's because they're listening to me read, but we're going to keep that on the probably just fishing quietly. All right, Alan's story. Watching his father's death from heart disease, Alan became convinced that he, like his father, would die young. When AIDS came along, Alan, a gay man in his 30s, thought, "That will be my disease." Alan, however, has been tested repeatedly for HIV and continues to test negative. Despite his apparent good health, Alan continues to be convinced that an early death will be his fate. Because his father died at the age of 40, Alan hopes that if he can magically stop the progress of time, perhaps he can fool death. The Grim Reaper might well pass him by, mistaking him for a younger man. Consequently, Alan tries to look young and act boyish. I'm always happy when people tell me that I look younger than my age. I would like to stop time. I don't want to take my father's place. I don't want to die. Alan's anxiety about death was shared by his mother, who worried constantly about her frail and incapacitated husband. I grew up with the feeling that the wolf was always at the door. One could never get too far from the specter of death. As a young man living in a large urban gay community, Alan is amazed that I have no friends who have been sick. It's as if I don't want to be near someone who might be dying. I keep my distance. I'm very careful about making friends. Alan is aware that he sometimes appears cold and unfeeling to his acquaintances, but he does not want to hear people's stories of illness and death. Recently, Alan met a man from another city with whom he wanted to begin a relationship. Once I heard that he was sick, I began to pull away. I told myself it was because he was from out of town. There go the birds. In fact, Alan knows that his desire to distance himself from this man was because he felt scared and anxious to be near someone who might be dying. I didn't know what to say. I didn't even know what to feel. Recently, a friend of Alan's told him that she had been diagnosed with cancer. He remembers panicking on the phone as she conveyed the information. He became almost deaf to her words. I wasn't sure what she was saying. I kept thinking, oh my God, oh my God. Although Alan is an intelligent and insightful man, he could not make sense of his friend's communication. He had to ask her several times exactly what was wrong and what her treatment might entail. When Alan failed to hear from his friend for 2 weeks, he was convinced that she was dead and became afraid to pick up the phone, call, and find out. This friend has recently invited Alan to come and visit her for a long weekend over the summer. Alan wants to visit his friend, in part because he wants to see her, and in part because he knows he must stare down this personal demon. Alan has reached a point in his life where he can no longer run from his fear of death. He asks himself, however, how can I get close to this woman? Is there any place for me in her life? Does she even have a life? Do I want her in my life? Alan is aware that he is phobic about the prospect of death and has sought counseling to help him deal with his pervasive death anxiety. Alan's inability to separate himself completely from someone who might be dying or sick harkens back to his inability to experience himself as a separate from his dying father. He says, "My father and I were merged. My whole family became occupied with his life. I always felt like I had his life." Alan must learn that each person finally has his or her own death. Death is not an experience that we share, but rather an experience that comes to each individual only once. In order to feel more at ease in his own life, Alan needs to stop living in the shadow of his father's death. For other survivors of early loss, fear of death makes itself felt, not as a fear for themselves, but rather as a fear of death for a loved one. Janice, whose father's early death left her mother an unhappy widow, is terrified that her husband will also die young, leaving her as her mother was left. Janice adored her father and always wanted to marry someone just like Dad. She sought a man who was bright, funny, ambitious, and hardworking. All of the things she so admired in her father. Now Janice fears that being like Dad might be a curse rather than a blessing. "I worry so much that my husband will die like my father, and then I will end up like my mother." Janice's fears are not entirely unfounded. Her husband has a history of heart disease in his family, and he himself has some early signs of coronary artery disease. Yet Janice knows that her fears are not solely based on her husband's medical history. She is convinced that the happy life she has made for herself will be taken away from her, just as her idyllic childhood vanished when her father died. "My life is just too good to last forever. I had an idyllic childhood and all of a sudden it was gone. This life is too good. I'm afraid death will get me again." Janice's fear of death makes her unable to enjoy her life fully. She is so worried about her husband's early death that she finds herself preoccupied and anxious when they are together and enjoying themselves. Although he is generally easygoing, Janice's husband has begun to become annoyed with her constant nagging and worry. Her obsession with his early death makes him uncomfortable and also prevents them from enjoying the time they do have. Oh, goodness. Watching birds, missing deer. It's strange, one's all by itself today. have like a page and a half to go. If I can get this read without getting any more distracted. Yeah, Janice feels, I have this great life. I wish I could just enjoy it. I try. I say to myself, just live each day to the fullest. But then I start to worry. Fully believing in her own early widowhood, Janice has taken steps to ensure that even if I am left like my mother, I won't be my mother. She has maintained her maiden name and has pursued an independent career. Although she and her husband are a close couple and enjoy a circle of mutual friends, Janice has been conscious to maintain a network of separate friends and separate interests. She maintains a fallback life. That she has not shared with her husband, and to which she could easily return once her husband is gone. In her own mind, Janice has imagined how she would meet her financial obligations and raise her 3 children without a husband to help. As much as she tries to live in the present, Janice feels burdened by a past that she is convinced foreshadows the future. Not all survivors who fear death appear anxious. Some engage in dangerous and at times life-threatening behavior in order to prove themselves and demonstrate. The dog's really snoring. Okay, I'm going to stop here. Janice has a fallback life that she has not shared with her husband and to which she could easily return once her husband is gone. In her own mind, Janice has imagined how she would meet her financial obligations and raise her 3 children without a husband to help. As much as she tries to live in the present, Janice feels burdened by a past that she is convinced foreshadows the futures. All right, I'm kind of in the middle of a section on page 195, but I'm going to stop here because it's hot. It's actually smoking hot, and there's like a lot of other, but I will be back. Thank you for listening. We are in chapter 8 of from the book The Loss That Is Forever by Maxine Harris, PhD. I appreciate you listening. Thank you for being with me this morning.